Hey guys, tonight we travel back to a time when marriage wasn't about love, chemistry, or even mutual respect. It was about land, politics, bloodlines, and surviving childbirth more times than you'd like to count. You're about to become the star of a Tudor wedding. And spoiler alert, you didn't get to pick the groom. The air smells faintly of incense and sweat. Your dress is impossibly heavy layers of velvet and embroidery stitched for someone who isn't expected to run, or think, or speak, unless spoken to. Your hair is pulled tight, your hands are cold, and your family is watching like hawks from the front pew. This isn't just your big day, it's a business deal, and you're the dowry with a pulse. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and your local time in the comments. I always love seeing how far this sleepy history caravan stretches. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You walk down the aisle, not in satin heels, but in tightly laced shoes that pinch at your ankles, beneath layers of petticoats that make each step more symbolic than practical. You aren't smiling. Brides didn't need to look joyful. They just needed to look obedient. Marriage in Tudor England wasn't a personal milestone, it was a transaction. One that had likely been negotiated years ago, long before you ever noticed boys or read romantic poetry by candlelight. Your groom. Perhaps you saw him once, from a balcony. Perhaps you've never met. If you're lucky, he's young and kind and not hideous. If you're unlucky, he's old and influential and sees your womb as a legacy vault. Either way, no one asks your opinion. Love is not part of the equation, only lineage. Historians still argue whether noble daughters had any influence in choosing a husband, but the general consensus, not really. Even in the middle classes, marriages were arranged for economic benefit, often sealed with a handshake between fathers. For the gentry and aristocracy, marriage was a form of political alliance. Your feelings were irrelevant. Your fertility, crucial. And here's the kicker. Once the deal was struck, breaking it was practically impossible. You might assume there were romantic exceptions, clever young women who eloped or refused. But no. The church had immense control over marriage laws, and the state reinforced it. Consent was technically required. Yes, but consent could mean very little. When your entire family was pressuring you and your future depended on it, you glance sideways at the priest. He drones on in Latin, a language you can barely understand, but the meaning is clear. You are being transferred, not unlike a parcel, from your father's household to your husband's control. It's not a union, it's a reassignment. Most people forget how young Tudor brides were. 14, sometimes 12, depending on your status. While consummation was often delayed until suitable age, whatever that meant, betrothals happened startlingly early. Meanwhile, grooms could be twice, even 3 times their brides' ages. It wasn't scandalous, it was strategic. You try not to tremble as your hand is placed into his. It's clammy, his rings are heavy, he avoids your eyes. It's hard to tell if he's nervous or just bored. The worst part, everyone around you thinks this is the best day of your life. There are painted smiles, stiff bows, and whispered, "Congratulations." You hear someone in the back mutter that you're a lucky girl. You try not to laugh, or cry. Once the vows are said, there's no turning back. Unlike today, where you might get an annulment, a no-fault divorce, or at least a legal separation, Tudor marriage was ironclad. The church treated it as a sacrament, unchangeable, eternal, and deeply suspicious of anyone who wanted out. Want a divorce? You'd need an act of parliament, or the Pope. Good luck with that. But hey, on the bright side, there's a feast waiting. Roast swan, sugared plums. A jester, maybe. Some bored musicians. You sit beside your new husband at the high table, stomach nodding as he talks politics with someone else. You realize, with a dull sinking feeling, that this table might be the most public part of your entire marriage. You're not just married, you're absorbed. Quirky fact of the night. Some betrothals were sealed by a ritual called handfasting, a sort of pre-wedding ceremony where couples clasped hands and declared intent to wed. In some cases, if the union was later consummated, it could be considered legally binding even if the formal wedding never happened. Surprise marriage. Anyone? The laughter at the table is low and polite. The candles flicker. You glance again at your husband, trying to read his expression, but he's already half drunk, discussing land taxes with someone twice his age. You sip your watered-down wine. You look down at your hands. This is it. The first day of forever. You wake up in a strange bed, in a strange house, beside a man who's still technically a stranger. The silk sheets itch. The room smells of smoke and lavender, and something musky you can't identify. A maid helps you dress before sunrise. By as if you've joined a play you never auditioned for. You've officially become a wife. Which, in Tudor terms, means you've also become an asset. Or maybe more like a ledger entry. You're no longer just your father's daughter. You're a dowry delivered, a future mother of sons, hopefully, and a point on a map that ties your family's fortune to someone else's ambition. Dowries, you realize, are not just wedding gifts. They are negotiations made in coin, cows, land, or even textiles. If your family is poor, they scrape together whatever they can, maybe a few acres, a chest of silver spoons, or a sack of woolens. If your family is wealthy, the stakes are higher. Entire manors might shift hands, along with political alliances sealed over pheasant pie. And here's the thing, they don't put in love poems once it's given. Your dowry doesn't belong to you, it goes straight to your husband's family, to manage as they see fit. That orchard you liked back home, gone. The chest of linens your grandmother embroidered, his now. You're not bitter yet. But as you sit through your first breakfast, surrounded by servants who won't meet your eye, it starts to sink in. You brought wealth to this house, but that doesn't mean power. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Historians still argue whether women of the gentry had any control over their dowries post-marriage. In theory, the husband was supposed to protect it. In practice, it often disappeared into family debts, risky investments, or if your new in-laws were particularly unlucky, gambling losses. It wasn't uncommon for widows to discover that their security had been mortgaged 5 years ago. Then there's the jointure, a promised income for you if your husband dies. Sounds fair, right? Except many jointures were more wishful thinking than solid legal protection. If the estate was mismanaged, or if your late husband's heir was greedy, you could be left with barely enough to keep a maid. And if you're wondering why this feels like a trap, it is. The dowry system ensured that marriages were less about love and more about leverage. Fathers wanted to climb the social ladder. Sons needed capital. And you were the very practical, very costly middle step. You glance at your husband. He's eating roast meat for breakfast, grease slicking his fingers. You're nibbling cold bread and trying not to look nauseated. The maid reappears. She bows, not to you, but to your husband. "Shall we begin showing the accounts, my lord?" she asks. Not even 9 a.m. And already, your worth is being counted again. Quirky fact break. In some Tudor contracts, the dowry included the bride's personal clothing, listed down to the hem. Imagine your wedding dress being itemized like a shipment of spices. 1 gown of green damask, 3 kirtles, 2 pairs of linen sleeves, 5 embroidered caps. And here's where it gets cruelly ironic. If the marriage failed, you didn't get your dowry back. It stayed with the husband's family. But if he believed you were unfaithful, he might sue to return your portion of the wealth. Yes, even in failure, the odds were rigged. You hear the bells from the local church ringing in the distance. Another wedding, maybe. Another girl. Another family preparing to say goodbye to their daughter. And hello to a stack of parchment contracts. You rise when your husband does. You follow him down stone corridors that echo with each of your footsteps. Everything in this house is his. The tapestries, the furniture, the very walls. You feel like a guest in your own life. Mainstream fact for the day, by Tudor law. Women could not own property independently once married. Under the principle of coverture, Their legal identity was absorbed into their husbands. If you inherited land, he controlled it. If you earned money, he spent it. You were, in legal terms, invisible. You pass a room filled with ledgers and scrolls. The dowry helped pay off Uncle Edmund's debt, your husband says casually, like you've chipped in for a tavern tab. Very convenient. You nod, not trusting yourself to speak. You're learning. Quiet is safe. Polite is strategic. Historians debate whether Tudor women accepted this system passively or resisted it in private. Some letters hint at fierce arguments. Behind closed doors, clever financial maneuvering, even secret savings hidden in embroidered purses. But those stories were rarely written down, and when they were dismissed as anomalies. You step outside, briefly, into the garden. It's early spring. Dew clings to the edges of rose leaves. A robin sings from the wall. You wonder, fleetingly, what it would feel like to be poor and in love. To marry someone you actually liked. To trade silks and land deeds for laughter and muddy shoes, but that version of life doesn't exist in Tudor England, not for women like you. You've been married a week, and already you understand this is not a partnership, it's a contract. And one with no escape clause. Unlike today, where divorce might be messy but still achievable, in Tudor England, once you were in until death, or plague, or, if you were truly lucky, a fatal jousting accident. You sit in the solar, embroidering in the thin daylight, listening to your husband and his steward talk loudly in the next room. The house is drafty, the fire underwhelming. Your needle pricks your finger, and a drop of blood stains the linen, fitting, because marriage, for you, is already starting to feel like a slow bleed. In theory, the church permitted annulments. In practice, they were granted about as often. As media strikes, you'd need to prove impotence, incest, consanguinity, or lack of consent. Good luck proving any of that. When everyone around you is invested in keeping the marriage intact. Your cousin Margaret once tried to escape her husband, claimed he was cruel, possibly mad, but her case was thrown out. Not because no one believed her, but because cruelty wasn't seen as grounds for ending a marriage. Marriage wasn't about happiness, it was about duty. And her duty, the court said, was to endure. Historians still argue whether Tudor England was truly uniquely harsh in its approach to marital permanence. After all, most of Europe had similar standards. But in England, the Reformation complicated things even more. Henry VIII, famously desperate for a male heir, twisted the religious and legal systems just to free himself from Catherine of Aragon. But you're not the king. You don't get a personal schism with Rome, you just get stuck. And even annulments, when granted, could ruin your life. They cast doubt on your morality, your children's legitimacy, and your family's reputation. A woman who pursued one was often whispered about for decades afterward. Unnatural, they'd say difficult. You set your embroidery down and walk slowly toward the window. Outside, a hawker's cart rattles past the manor gates. The sound of clinking metal reminds you of something ominous. A cage door. Mainstream. Fact check. Until the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857. Yes. 1857 divorce in England was only possible through a private act of parliament. That meant rich men could petition the government. And women, unless backed by enormous wealth and luck, could not. Quirky detail for the night, some men faked reasons for annulment, hiring false witnesses to claim their wives were cousins or had been pre-contracted, i.e. promised to someone else before. There are court records with hilariously specific lies, like one man insisting his wife's previous engagement had been sealed with a kiss over goose stew. Sadly, they worked. You sip watered wine, not because you're thirsty, but because the motion distracts your thoughts. You're beginning to wonder how many women went mad this way, pacing corridors, sewing endlessly, praying for death or war to release them. Your husband enters the room. He smiles vaguely. He doesn't seem cruel, just distracted. Like this marriage is a business arrangement that's already checked off his list. You force a smile. You're learning to mimic contentment the way others might mimic accents. At dinner, The steward announces that Lord Braxton's daughter is to be married next month. She's 13. A good match, your husband says, carving into a pheasant leg. He's an earl's second son, and she's got 400 acres. Promised you chew slowly. You remember playing with her once. She had a crooked front tooth and a fascination with toads. You want to say something? Anything. But your voice stays buried behind your ribs. The table falls quiet except for the sound of knives on pewter. Historians debate whether women truly believed in the permanence of their marriages or merely accepted it out of survival instinct. Some left behind letters full of devotion and spiritual resignation. Others, like poor Anaskew, defied her husband's religious beliefs, ended up tortured and executed. So, make of that what you will. Later that night, you lie in bed and listen to the wind whip against the shutters. Your husband snores lightly beside you. You stare at the rafters and think about how long a lifetime actually is. You begin to understand the true cost of vows that can never be undone. They weigh on you, not like chains, but like centuries. The church bells toll before sunrise, dragging you from sleep with all the subtlety of a drum roll. Your maid arrives with a candle and a pot of something that smells faintly of onions and regret. Time to dress, my lady, she whispers. You nod, already tired, and it's not even dawn. Today marks a fortnight since your wedding, and already you've been told twice that it's time to settle into your duties. You're not sure if that means managing the household, producing heirs, or simply keeping quiet and not embarrassing anyone in front of the steward. What you do know is this: the vows you took weren't poetry. They were shackles. You're starting to notice the corners of your world shrinking with each passing day. And unlike the hopeful kind of shrinking that happens when you cozy up under blankets, this kind feels like walls closing in. Your wedding vows were binding in the most literal sense. There were no escape clauses, no prenups, no irreconcilable differences. The church declared marriage a holy sacrament, not a social agreement. Once made, it could not be unmaidenless. Of course, you were rich, male, and politically inconvenient. And if you think separation might be an option, living apart, maybe in a nice cottage somewhere, sipping broth and writing melancholic poetry. Not really. Separation was possible in rare cases, but it didn't free you. You were still married, still tethered. You just happened to be miserable in different postal codes. Historians still argue whether the church's grip on marriage was about morality or control, likely both. The clergy had a vested interest in keeping couples united. A stable household was easier to manage. A disobedient wife, a threat to both domestic and divine order. You walk through the great hall, past the fireplace, where the cook is already berating a scullery boy. It smells of wood smoke and burned fat. You're handed a list of tasks for the day. Inspect the linen stores. Write to your father about the spring harvest. And here's the real kicker. Pray for conception. That's right. 2 weeks in, and already the household is whispering about signs. You overhear two maids speculating about whether your appetite has changed. One says, you looked a little pale yesterday. Another swears your cheeks are fuller. As if your womb has a neon sign visible from across the courtyard. Mainstream fact alert. Tudor wives were expected to conceive quickly. A barren marriage was not just disappointing, it was politically dangerous. For the upper classes, children weren't sentimental, they were succession, proof that the alliance had taken root. A wife who failed to produce an heir within the first year, often replaced emotionally, if not physically. Quirky tidbit: some Tudor families held small fertility feasts after weddings where couples were gifted fertility potions, lucky herbs, and advice that ranged from the mystical to the mortifying. One recipe involved rose petals, soaked in goat's milk, and prayed over by 3 virgins. No pressure. You try to focus on the linen, folded neatly, counted, smelling faintly of lavender and old cedarwood. You write a note to your father in perfect practiced script. You say you're well, that your husband is kind, that the house is large and the servants respectful. You don't mention the panic that wakes you at 3 a.m., or the fact that you haven't laughed in 2 weeks. Your husband finds you at the writing desk. He smiles and kisses your forehead like a man greeting a well-behaved pet. The steward says you're doing well, he says. You smile back, equally performative. I'm trying, you reply. Trying to survive, that is. Later, you walk through the gardens. The daffodils are blooming. Bees hover lazily over the lavender bushes. A part of you wonders what your life might have been like if you'd been born a man, free to travel, to earn, to choose, to leave, but you weren't. And here's the reality check. Even if you had somehow avoided marriage, there weren't many good alternatives. The convent. That was for women with religious fervor or families too poor to arrange a match. Work, not a respectable option. Spinsterhood, socially fatal. Tudor society saw unmarried women as suspicious, incomplete, and often a little bit cursed. So you married, because it was the only real path laid out for you. And now you walk it daily, like a garden maze with no exit. Historians debate whether Tudor women internalized these roles or quietly resisted them. Letters and diaries suggest both. Some embraced the domestic role, pouring themselves into children and household management. Others chafed against the limitations, seeking solace in poetry, prayer, or even rebellion. But the outcome was often the same. They remained trapped. You sit on a stone bench, sunlight warm on your face. You close your eyes and pretend, for just a moment, that you're alone, not in the legal sense, but in the peaceful one. No duties, no eyes watching, no bells ringing, just stillness. But the wind shifts, the bell rings again, and you stand, because you must. You're seated beside your husband at yet another feast. The meat is overcooked, the wine slightly sour, and the conversation around you spirals between topics you barely understand and stories you've already heard. You nod politely as he retells the same anecdote about the falconer and the runaway goose. For the third time this week, you're 15, he's 40-2. And that, disturbingly, isn't even the most unusual part. In Tudor England, marriages with massive age gaps weren't just tolerated, they were expected, especially among the upper class. Older men with established wealth and estates sought younger brides to secure their legacy and ensure multiple chances at male heirs. You, young and supposedly fertile, are more investment than companion. Historians still argue whether these matches were solely strategic or occasionally affectionate. There are rare cases of real tenderness between such couples, but more often, the power imbalance turned marriage into a kind of quiet servitude. You're beginning to feel it now. Your husband, kind though he may seem in public, doesn't see you, not as a person. He sees you as the future mother of his children, as someone to sit prettily at the table, as a silent figure in the background of his very public life. This morning he handed you a gift, a jeweled comb. Lovely, useless. When you asked about finances for the kitchen staff, he waved a hand and said, "Don't trouble yourself with such things," as if you were a doll with no need for numbers. You sip from your goblet and glance around the room. The other noble women are smiling, nodding, engaging in that delicate verbal dance of flattery and veiled criticism. One of them, Lady Cecily, whispers that her daughter is betrothed to a baron pushing 60. "She's 12, Cecily says with a sigh, then adds with a strained smile, "but he's very wealthy." You nod in silence. What is there to say? Mainstream fact. The legal age for marriage in Tudor England was 12 for girls and 14 for boys, though consummation was often delayed until the wife was deemed physically mature. But mature was a fluid concept, and social pressure meant many girls were expected to fulfill wifely duties far earlier than is remotely comfortable to imagine today. Your husband raises his glass to toast a local magistrate. You echo the motion. With mechanical grace, it occurs to you that you haven't laughed at Raelian over a month. You retreat to your chambers early, citing a headache. No one questions it. Headaches, after all, are one of the few allowed forms of female agency. You lie in bed, staring at the embroidered canopy. It's covered in tiny stitched roses. You wonder how long it took someone to make it. Days, weeks, a lifetime. You feel a kinship with that unknown woman creating something intricate and beautiful while trapped in the same tiny square of space. Quirky detail of the night. One Tudor breed aged 11 was reportedly so small that a custom cradle had to be built for her to sleep in until she grew into her marriage bed. Romantic, right? Sometimes, when you think no one can hear, you sing under your breath. Quiet songs from childhood. Rhymes that never made it into your adult world. You miss the simplicity of those days when your name belonged to you and your choices stretched ahead like an open field, not a locked corridor. Historians debate how these age-gap marriages affected the inner lives of Tudor women. Some letters show young brides expressing gratitude for security and elevation in status. Others, particularly those who survived their husbands and lived long enough to remarry, describe a sense of emotional starvation. One widow, in a rare surviving journal, wrote, "I was a wife for 20 years and never once spoken to, as though I were clever." You think about that line often. Tomorrow, your husband leaves for London. He'll be gone a month, maybe 2. You're expected to manage the estate in his absence, but only the soft parts. Organizing feasts, overseeing servants, pretending the accounts run themselves. The steward will handle the money. The men will handle the matters of consequence. Still, a tiny spark flares in you. Maybe, in his absence, you can breathe a little, read longer, walk the grounds without someone narrating your schedule. Maybe you can be yourself. Whoever that is, you rise and move to the window. The moon is high. The courtyard is still. You whisper a small promise to yourself. When he leaves, you will take back 1 hour each day. 1 hour for something that belongs only to you, not for childbearing, not for politeness, not for duty, just for the girl you used to be. The door creaks open and closes behind him. Just like that, your husband is gone off to London to attend court, or argue over grain tariffs, or do whatever it is noblemen claim is critical while their wives hold down the crumbling fort. A flurry of stable boys, travel cloaks, and last-minute instructions whirl through the great hall. And then finally, quiet dot. You stand alone in the echo of his absence. And you feel lighter dot for the first time since your wedding day. The house doesn't feel like a theater stage. The servants exhale in subtle ways. The cook lets the kitchen fire burn a little longer. The steward smiles without tightening his jaw. The maids speak in their regular voices. It turns out the whole manor has been holding its breath with you. But before you get too comfortable, there's a knock at your chamber door. It's your sister in-law, not the warm and fuzzy kind, the other kind. She's brought a bundle of documents and a shriveled smile. "Time to go over your duties," she says. As if you haven't already memorized every corner of this place, and then, just as quickly, she drops the bomb. Also, you'll need to prepare in case of his death. Should something happen, you'll be expected to marry his brother. It's all in the contract. You blink, you smile. You very nearly throw the tea tray dot. It's not a joke. Mainstream historical fact. In Tudor England, especially among the nobility, it was not unusual for a widow to be married off to her deceased husband's brother or cousin. This kept property and alliances intact. The practice had roots in levirate marriage traditions and remained, in spirit, if not law. For generations, historians still debate how often these recycled marriages actually occurred versus how often they were simply threats or legal clauses left unfulfilled. But the mere expectation was enough to haunt a young wife's sleep. You weren't just marrying a man, you were marrying his family, and possibly his entire bloodline. You imagine it now. Your husband dies, not tragically, just inconveniently. And the next face at your breakfast table is his younger brother who once asked if you knew how to churn butter. As a joke, you ask your sister-in-law if this clause is common. She shrugs. It's prudent. After all, the estate must remain whole. And there it is, again that subtle language of ownership. Not love, not grief, just estate management. You, your body, your future, they're not yours. They are assets, to be redistributed in times of widowhood. Quirky tidbit of the day: there's a documented case of a Tudor noblewoman who was widowed 3 times, and each time married a different brother from the same family. She joked, near the end of her life, that she'd finally run out of siblings. Probably, you sit by the fire later, parchment in your lap, reading the household inventory for the 100th time. You're trying to feel like you have some control. But even your quill seems rebellious. Today ink splatters across the page, ruining the list of dried fruits and spice stores. You toss the sheet into the flames. That's when you start thinking, what would happen if you did nothing? If your husband did die, and you simply refused to remarry, could they force you? The answer, as you soon learn, is complicated. Legally, widows had more autonomy than married women. You could own property, make contracts, even sue in court. But, socially, the pressure to remarry was immense. Unmarried noblewomen, even widows, were seen as threats to the social fabric. Too much freedom, too little supervision. Historians argue whether this pressure stemmed more from family interest or state expectation. Likely both. A single woman with wealth and no male guardian disrupted the careful power maps of Tudor society. You poke the fire and wonder how many women stayed single after widowhood. Not many, you guess. And those who did were usually painted as oddities or witches, especially if they had strong opinions, or wore black a little too long. Your maid brings you a letter from your cousin Agnes. She's been married 6 years, has 4 children, and recently lost her husband to a fever caught at sea. She writes, "I should be sad, and perhaps I will be later, but for now, I feel like I've been returned to myself." You fold the letter carefully. You press it to your chest. You understand, because even now, when the house is quieter, freer, yours for the moment, you know it won't last. The wheels of family and expectation are already turning. And should your husband fall from a horse, or eat a bad fig, or offend the wrong noble, you'd be expected to smile through your mourning veil and say, "I do all over again," to someone else's brother. You're walking slowly through the palace corridor, your shoes whispering over stone, trailing behind the Queen's procession. You are one of her ladies in waiting now, or perhaps more accurately, one of her watchers, her shadows, her silent, ribbonless witnesses to the machinery of courtship that grinds on regardless of desire. The court is dazzling. Gold embroidery, fragrant rushes underfoot, jewels glinting like tiny verdicts around every neck. But behind the sparkle, you begin to understand that this is not a place for love. It is a theater, a stage for power and position, and the most strategic of glances. You sit, hands folded, watching a young noblewoman drop her fan deliberately near a handsome ambassador. He retrieves it with a bow that's deeper than strictly necessary. Around them, conversation continues as though nothing has happened, but every pair of eyes notes the exchange. Every whisper is recorded. At court, romance is a weapon, one you are taught to handle without ever drawing blood. Mainstream fact: ladies in waiting were not just attendants, they were pawns in royal matchmaking, conduits for gossip, and occasionally, decoys or spies. Their job was to be visible, agreeable, and available, not necessarily for affection, but for alliance. You remember the first time someone courted you at court. He was charming, yes, but also calculated. His compliments were practiced, his poetry suspiciously derivative, and the moment it became clear your dowry was already promised elsewhere, he vanished like morning mist. Historians still argue whether courtship in the Tudor era ever allowed for true romance. Some couples wrote passionate letters, some defied their families, but far more often, love was postponed until after the paperwork cleared. If it came at all, and as a lady in waiting, you're not encouraged to want more. Your job is to learn to smile, to sew, to play the lute badly enough, to seem modest, and to not fall in love with anyone inappropriate, which includes almost everyone. You are constantly watched. By chaperones, by the Queen, by other women, who though kind understand that every marriageable man is a limited resource. Friendship in the Tudor court is complicated. Sweet, sometimes, but always a little sharp dash-edged dot. Today, you're summoned to attend the Queen's private dinner. You stand behind her, pouring wine when summoned, helping her lace her sleeves, adjusting her veil. She speaks to you only once, to ask if you've heard from your husband. You answer softly, "Not in 2 weeks, Your Majesty." She nods, then changes the subject, and yet, her eyes linger on you. Not unkindly. Perhaps she remembers what it was like to be young, newly married, and unsure if your life was your own. Quirky tidbit: Anne of Cleves, famously Henry VIII's fourth wife, had been sent a portrait of the king before their wedding, but the painting was generous. When they finally met in person, she reportedly didn't recognize him, and he was so offended by her lack of enthusiasm that he annulled the marriage after 6 months. She, however, lived happily on a generous pension, one of the few Tudor women who arguably benefited from a failed match. You walk back to your quarters after the Queen retires, your feet aching. The corridor is empty, torchlight flickering on the tapestries. You pause beside one Saint Margaret, holding a dragon by the throat. She looks calm, serene, unreal. You wonder how many women before you have stood in this hallway and asked the same question. When do I get to choose? Historians debate the autonomy of noblewomen at court. Some wielded influence through their proximity to power. Others, like Jane Boleyn or Catherine Howard, paid for their missteps with their lives. The rules were unwritten, constantly shifting. The punishment, however, was always clear. You undress in silence. You look at yourself in the mirror, hair pinned tightly, skin pale from winter and stress. You look like a painting, which is too, say, still, flat, curated. At night, you dream of simpler things. Not grand romances or escape, but smaller rebellions. A morning without corsets. A walk without a chaperone. A letter that says exactly what you feel, sent without fear. You wake with a start and a faint smile, because even here, surrounded by etiquette and expectation, your mind is your own. Quietly, secretly, entirely, and maybe, just maybe, that's where the rebellion begins. The bells chime for matins, but you don't move. You lie in bed, wrapped in layers of wool and thought, listening as footsteps echo toward chapel. Another day of devotion, another day of obedience, another day married to a man who isn't even here. You've come to understand that your life now swings between 2 poles, performance and penance. You perform the part of the good wife, the elegant hostess, the obedient daughter-in-law, and when that gets too heavy, you retreat to prayer, hoping futilely that someone upstairs is listening. This morning, you're scheduled to attend Mass. Not out of deep faith, necessarily, but because it's expected. Religion here isn't just belief, it's choreography. Your presence at church proves your virtue. Your silence proves your discipline, and your marriage, well, that's the physical manifestation of sacrament, mainstream fact. In Tudor England, marriage was considered a holy sacrament by the Catholic Church, right up until Henry VIII decided it wasn't. Even after the Reformation, the institution retained its spiritual weight. The Church, and later the Crown, viewed it as a stabilizing force for society. Not a romantic adventure, a sacred obligation. You sit through the service with folded hands, knees aching against the stone floor. The priest intones blessings in Latin, his voice echoing from the rafters like distant thunder. You watch the candles flicker. You try not to think about the quiet trap you're in. Historians still argue whether religion reinforced, or merely masked, the patriarchy in Tudor marriage. Did the church sanctify a woman's suffering? Or did it simply provide the language to make obedience feel like virtue? You whisper the prayers. Not because you believe in divine intervention, but because silence, even directed upward, feels better than screaming into the wall. After Mass, a neighbor visits a baroness you haven't seen in months. She brings a gift, a carved wooden box filled with herbs. For your womb, she says with a wink. A little help from Saint Margaret. You thank her, then stare at the box for a long time after she's gone. It smells like dried roses and damp soil. Quirky tidbit: Saint Margaret of Antioch, the unofficial patron saint of childbirth. was so popular among Tudor women that many would wear small charms bearing her image, or hide her name embroidered into the hems of their gowns. Superstition and faith weren't separate. They danced together. You spend the afternoon overseeing laundry. You try to engage with the maids, to joke a little, but your smile feels thin. You can tell they don't quite know how to treat you still. Too young to be fully madam, too married to be one of them. You float in between. UNMOORED. That night. You attend a local gathering, nothing grand, just a dinner with neighboring families. You dress carefully, choose your jewelry with restraint, and make conversation like a woman trained for court. But all the while, your mind drifts. You see a girl, no older than 13, being introduced to a widowed knight. She curtsies perfectly. He nods approvingly. You feel your stomach turn. You know this dance. You've danced it. After dinner, a priest gives a brief homily on the virtue of fidelity. A wife's duty is to preserve her husband's peace, he says, and in doing so, her soul's. You wonder, idly, if a husband ever lost sleep over preserving your peace. Mainstream fact 2. The official marriage vows in Tudor England placed obedience squarely on the bride's shoulders. To love, cherish, and obey was not just poetic, was policy. And disobedience wasn't just a domestic concern. It could be punished legally. You return home late, the air cold and damp. You remove your jewels, unlace your bodice, and sit quietly at your vanity. You look at yourself in the candlelight. For a second, you see your mother's face. She survived this too, didn't she? You remember the quiet sadness in her eyes. The way she spoke of marriage, not as a joy, but as a phase of life, like winter. Something you get through, not something you celebrate. Historians debate whether women of that era ever redefined marriage from the inside. There are glimpses records of wives managing estates brilliantly, or negotiating treaties from behind the curtain, but for most, marriage was a quiet, slow suffocation, not dramatic, not cruel, just constant. And tonight, in the flicker of your candle, you feel that constancy in your bones. You pray once more before bed, not because you think it'll change anything, but because routine is sometimes the only armor you have. Your final thought before sleep is not of love, or future children, or even your husband. It is this: I belong to no one in my dreams. You're sitting in the chapel garden, watching a bee wobble clumsily between dying autumn flowers. When the thought returns, 1. You've been gently batting away for weeks now. What if he never comes back? Not in a tragic sense. There's been no word of illness or accident, just a slow, stuttering silence from London. Letters delayed, excuses from the steward. You've sent 3 yourself, all beautifully written, all unanswered, and the absurd part. You're not sure if you're worried or hopeful. Marriage, you've learned, is not about presence. It's about permanence. Your husband can be gone for weeks, months even, and yet your life is still organized around his imagined return. Meals are prepared in case he arrives. His clothes are brushed. The good wine is untouched. His absence is a shadow with weight but mainstream. Fact: Tudor husbands, especially those with courtly or military obligations, were often away from home for long periods. Their wives were left to manage the household, but always on his behalf, never as her own person. Powered by proxy, authority on loan. You walk the halls alone most days now, inspecting linen stores, checking firewood, answering trivial questions about table arrangements. Everyone defers to you, but not out of respect, out of hierarchy, because you are my lord's wife, not a name, a title. Historians still argue whether noble women truly found satisfaction in this managerial role. Some seemed to, others based on the marginalia in prayer books and bitter lines in private letters, clearly did not. You've started imagining a life without him, not as a widow, precisely, but as someone suspended, neither married nor single, neither joyful nor bereaved, just waiting. And here's the trap. If he were to die, your life wouldn't return to you. It would merely shift, a different set of obligations, a new version of the cage. You remember what happened to your aunt. Eleanor. Her husband died from a fall during a hunt. Everyone wept. The next morning, her father had already begun arranging a second match. You've proven fertile, he'd said. That's a strong bargaining chip. Quirky detail of the night. In some particularly calculating Tudor families, a woman's confinement record was tracked: how many births, how many sons, how many survived beyond infancy. It was like a morbid ledger of usefulness. And yes, future husbands reviewed it. Today, a visiting cousin arrives unexpectedly. She's widowed, 32, and draped in mourning silks that hang off her like black waves. Her voice is soft. Her gaze is sharp. You admire her immediately. She tells you, in private, that she has refused to remarry. They tried to press a suitor on me last year, she whispers over embroidery. I told them I would rather take holy orders than share my bed with another arrogant corpse in training. You almost laugh. You nearly cry. She asks you if you're happy. It's such a blunt question, delivered without warning, that you fumble for an answer. You say, I'm doing my duty. She doesn't smile. That's not what I asked. Historians debate whether Tudor women truly had the spiritual option of a convent once they were married. Some did, especially if they had strong connections to religious houses. But post-Reformation England made that route nearly impossible. The great dissolutions under Henry VIII closed hundreds of nuns. Escape became a luxury only the rare could afford. You find yourself reading more, at night, old romances, fables, even the occasional sermon that focuses less on obedience and more on peace. You light a candle after everyone's gone to bed, and you pretend you're not anyone's wife, just a quiet mind, in a quiet room, turning pages no one else will ever see. One night, you dream of yourself in a small cottage by the sea. No titles, no sets, you're carrying water, laughing, sun on your cheeks. A man appears, but he's no one you recognize. He says nothing, he just listens. You wake up with tears on your cheeks. Not because the dream was sad, but because it felt like freedom. Mainstream fact too. The idea of romantic marriage was emerging in this period slowly, unevenly. The rise of companionate marriage would take root in the following centuries, especially among Protestants. But in Tudor times, it remained an ideal, not a norm. And as you stare into the garden again, the bee long gone, the wind a little sharper, you realize this simple truth. You are not mourning your absent husband. You are mourning the girl who thought marriage might be different. The Queen is with child again. The news spreads through court like spilled wine, quick, sticky, impossible to clean up. Servants whisper it before the priests can confirm. Midwives are summoned, herbs are fetched, and everyone's behavior changes. Subtly, as if the very air must now tiptoe, and you feel the old, familiar, not twist in your stomach. Because when the Queen is pregnant, the kingdom holds its breath. When you're pregnant, that's just what's expected. You remember your own announcement. There was no fanfare, no procession, just a relieved nod from your husband and an immediate shipment of extra linen. One maid congratulated you. The steward gave you a new timetable. Everyone else moved on. But the Queen, her swelling belly becomes a matter of national security. Mainstream fact. Producing a male heir was one of the most high-stakes aspects of queenship in Tudor England. Queens were expected to bear children, preferably sons, and preferably more than one. Failure to do so wasn't just seen as personal misfortune. It was framed as divine displeasure. Historians still argue whether this pressure was borne more heavily by queens or the noblewomen who mimicked them. The answer, naturally, is both. But for queens, the consequences were broadcast. For wives like you, they played out quietly in bedrooms, birthing chambers, and graveyards. You're not currently pregnant. You've missed a month or two, but nothing more. The midwife came, pressed her cold hands to your abdomen, and said, maybe, maybe not. Then she left you with a bag of dried raspberry leaves and no real answers. You don't want to hope. Hope, you've learned, is a dangerous indulgence. A quiet craving you can't afford, because here's the truth. No one says out loud, childbirth might kill you. Quirky tidbit of the night. One Tudor remedy for a difficult womb involved tying a dead toad in a silk bag and wearing it around the neck. It did nothing, of course, except smell terrible and occasionally fall into the soup. But desperate women tried it anyway. Your maid, Alice, whispers that Lady Fenton died last week in labor, her third stillbirth, her fourth attempt. They say the baby had teeth, she adds with a shiver. As if the child came out biting the world that killed its mother. You nod, but you already knew, because the gossip of female suffering travels fastest, and no matter how luxurious your bedding, or how richly embroidered your cradle, every woman at court shares the same whispered prayer, "Let me live." Your cousin Agnes writes again. She's managing her estate as a widow now, and has decided never to remarry. The pain of birth was only surpassed by the fear of it, she says plainly. And yet, I was expected to return to bed as soon as I bled clean. You fold the letter slowly. You think of the Queen, lying in her grand chamber, surrounded by physicians and astrologers, herbs hanging from every beam, and yet none of it matters if the child doesn't survive. All that spectacle, all that hope, and all for a coin toss. Of blood and breath. Mainstream fact 2. Maternal mortality in Tudor England was astonishingly high. Even among the wealthy, childbirth was one of the leading causes of death for women of reproductive age. Fever, hemorrhage, obstructed labor, none discriminated by class. A queen could die just as easily as a scullery maid. You attend a small supper that evening. No one eats much. Everyone speculates on whether the queen will have a boy. One man swears his pigeons predicted a male heir. Another claims to have dreamt of lions. You choose slowly. Say nothing, because you've learned, by now, that silence is safer than hope. Later that night, you walk alone in the orchard. The air is cool, the trees are bare. You rest your hand on your lower belly, not in hope, but in caution. You wonder if something is beginning, or ending, or if it's all just noise. Historians debate how Tudor women understood their bodies. Medical texts of the time were riddled with superstition, and many women relied on herbs, midwives, and whispered advice, passed down like heirlooms. But deep down, most knew the truth. Your body wasn't yours. It was a vessel, a risk, a battlefield in soft skin. And as you returned to the manor, your fingers curled around the rosary in your pocket. You think not of heirs, or kingdoms, or cradles. You think, please, let me not die for this. Because in Tudor marriage, producing life always meant gambling with your own. You see her for the first time at a hunting feast, laughing radiant, and perched confidently at your husband's side like she's always belonged there. She's young, maybe even younger than you were when you wed. Her hair catches the firelight. Her voice rings like silver dot. She is not your enemy, but you understand, in one glance, that she is his mistress. It doesn't shock you. It doesn't even sting, not in the way it once might have. It just settles into you like cold rain through wool. Unwelcome, but familiar. You've heard whispers for weeks, maids passing notes. The steward clearing his throat when her name came up in passing. But now, watching them from across the table, there's no need to speculate. His eyes linger. His hand brushes hers when he passes the venison, and you smile, you lift your goblet, you perform, because you're not allowed to feel anything about it, not publicly, not even privately really. Mainstream fact, in Tudor society, male infidelity was tolerated, even expected. A nobleman who kept a mistress was not shamed, he was admired, his masculinity affirmed. His wife, meanwhile, was expected to turn a blind eye, maintain the household, and raise legitimate heirs. Dignity through silence. You excuse yourself early. Your maid follows you up the stairs, unasked. She pretends not to see the way. Your hands shake slightly as she removes your earrings. You say nothing, neither does she. This, too, is part of the script. Historians still argue whether noblewomen had any recourse when their husbands took mistresses. Occasionally, a wife might appeal to the church or even the crown, but rarely with success. The system was built to protect his pleasures, not your pain. And here's the ironic twist. Mistresses often had more freedom than wives. They weren't legally bound. They didn't have to run the estate or bear the heirs. Some even lived comfortably, protected by patronage and favored status. Without enduring childbirth or courtly obligation, you lie in bed, staring at the canopy, thinking about that. She gets laughter, and conversation, and as it may be, you get linen inventories and blood on your thighs. Quirky tidbit. Henry VIII's court was rife with officially unofficial mistresses. One of his early favorites, Elizabeth Blount, bore him a son, Henry Fitzroy, who was openly acknowledged and showered with titles. His wives didn't always get such generosity. The next morning, you see her, again this time in your garden. She's admiring the roses you planted last spring. You walk by without stopping. She curtsies, eyes wide, lips tight with a small, practiced smile. She knows who you are. She knows what she is. And in that brief glance, something passes between you that has nothing to do with jealousy. It's recognition. You both know the rules. You both know who wrote them. Later that week, your husband returns home late. He smells of wine and cloves and someone else's perfume. He talks cheerfully about a new tapestry for the Great Hall. He tells you the Queen's pregnancy is progressing. He compliments your embroidery. You nod. You pour him wine. You feel nothing. Mainstream. Fact 2. Undercover. A married woman's legal identity was absorbed into her husband's. She could not sue, own property, or enter contracts independently. Even if her husband flaunted infidelity, she had no legal ground to challenge him, only to endure him. You begin spending more time in the library, rereading the same texts. You find yourself drawn to saints, lives, especially the ones who refused marriage, who took vows of silence, who turned their pain into miracles. You're not looking for sainthood, just instruction. One passage lingers in your mind. She bore her suffering with grace, and in her stillness, she became a voice. Historians debate how Tudor women expressed rebellion within rigid domestic roles. Some used patronage to promote religious reform or poetry. Some found subtle ways to assert control over their households, their wardrobes, even their children's tutors. But many, perhaps most simply, survived. And in surviving, resisted. That night, you place your rosary beside the comb he gave you on your wedding night. Both are symbols of who you were supposed to be. Neither quite fits anymore. You don't weep. You don't rage. You do something far more dangerous. You begin to imagine what life could look like if you stopped playing the role. You're not free, but you are awake. And in Tudor marriage, that might be the most radical thing of all. There's a knock at the study door. 3 soft raps. It's the steward, of course it always is. You close the ledger and rise from the desk as he enters, bowing just slightly. Deferential, but not overly so. He's brought the week's accounts. He hands them to you. Not your husband, because your husband still hasn't returned. And even if he had, the steward would still hand them to him, not to her. Because you, wife, though you may be, are not a legal person. Not in the way he is. You nod and dismiss him. Then you open the scroll, quill in hand, and begin reviewing expenses, ink flowing across parchment with a quiet fury. You've learned to keep immaculate accounts. You track every bolt of linen, every sack of barley, every penny paid to the farrier. It gives you a sliver of control in a world that denies you ownership of your own name. Mainstream fact, undercover. The prevailing legal doctrine in Tudor England, a married woman had no separate legal identity from her husband. She could not own property. She could not sign contracts. She could not file lawsuits. Anything she inherited or earned became his by law. You sit back in your chair, the candle flickering over the ink-stained curve of your hand. You think of all the work you've done organizing the household, educating the younger servants, maintaining order in his absence. And yet, if anyone asked whose estate this is, the answer would be his. Always. His historians still argue whether coverture was strictly enforced in daily life or functioned more as a legal umbrella under which individual marriages varied. Some couples, especially in wealthier or more educated circles, treated each other as informal partners. But the law did not bend for affection. Your maid arrives with a letter from your cousin. She's pregnant again. Her fifth. Her tone is weary, but kind. She says the physician told her to stop reading it, agitates the blood. You smile, just barely, and return to your own book. It's a treatise on household management, not the popular kind, full of cheerful aphorisms and recipes for preserving quince, but a sharper one written by a widow who managed her late husband's estate for 20 years before dying rich and alone. You admire her. The margins of the book are filled with notes in your own hand. Quirky tidbit of the night. Some Tudor women, especially wealthy widows, did wield remarkable power-managing manners, arranging marriages, even influencing court decisions, but only as widows. As wives, they had to wait for their husbands to die before the world would acknowledge their intelligence. You look around the study-oaked paneling. Cold hearth, shelf after shelf of leather-bound knowledge. You've read most of them now, quietly, after hours, by candlelight. Not because anyone asked you to, but because you needed something that was yours. You remember your wedding day, the way your name disappeared under layers of silk and signatures. You signed that registry as wife of. You were never asked what you wanted to be. Now, as your hand moves confidently across the account sheet, you realize something. You've become competent, efficient, skilled, and legally. You are still invisible. You step outside for air. The courtyard is dark, but the stars are clear. You walk slowly, feeling the cold bite at your fingers. Somewhere, an owl calls. A fox shrieks. And in that moment, you feel strangely, fiercely present. Historians debate whether Tudor women accepted their legal invisibility or challenged it in private. Letters and diaries suggest that many understood the injustice clearly. But the system was so total woven into church, law, and family that rebellion rarely made it past the ink of frustration. You return to the house, you return to the ledgers, because, for now, all you can do is keep the house in order. Keep the books clean. Keep the appearance of harmony. And yet, every name you write, every expense you tally, every document you prepare in your husband's name deep down, you know the truth. You may not own this estate, but you run it, and sometimes, in the quiet tyranny of marriage, that difference is all a woman has to cling to. There's no honeymoon in the Tudor world. Not unless you count sweating through layers of linen while learning how to pickle onions and calculate sheep rotors. No voyage to Venice. No lazy mornings with fresh pears and poems. You wake after your wedding to chores, to charts, and to a constant stream of people who expect you to already know how to manage an entire manor. It's your third month married, and someone has finally handed you the household keys. They jingle ominously from the thick loop of cord, heavier than they look. You wear them at your waist now, swinging like the world's most joyless accessory. Symbolically, they mean you're in charge of the domestic realm. Practically, they mean you're the one who gets blamed when the grain stores are low or the servants sneak into the preserves. Mainstream fact. The mistress of a noble or gentry household in Tudor England had enormous logistical responsibility. She was expected to oversee everything from meal planning to soap making, staffing decisions to linen inventories. It was a full-time role no matter your age, no matter your interest. The house runs like a living creature. Fires must be lit. Before dawn, meals cooked for dozens, livestock counted, wash tubs filled, candles trimmed, guests entertained, and you, at the center of it all, must remain gracious, clean, cheerful. You miss the days when the most complex decision you made was choosing ribbon colors. Now you're explaining to a carpenter why the new benches wobble. You're arguing politely with a brewer about diluted ale. You're negotiating wages, balancing eggs, and pretending you enjoy discussing pig feed. Quirky tidbit: many noblewomen kept their own recipe books, but these weren't just for cakes and tarts. They included treatments for ailments, cleaning, formulas, and oddities like how to remove stains from a monk's robe, or to drive mice from a granary without cats. If your herbs failed, the mice stayed. You begin to understand the rhythm of the house. Who shirks work? Who works in silence? Who listens at doors? You know which servant burns the morning porridge, and which one secretly reads the steward's letters. You know which scullery girl is sneaking sugar from the pantry, and you choose not to say anything, because honestly, you'd do the same. But this isn't your house. Not really. Your name isn't on the deeds. Your signature isn't valid. If your husband returned tomorrow and chose to replace you, no one would stop him. You could be packed off to a cousin's estate or a chilly convent guest room with nothing but your embroidery hoops and your reputation. Historians still argue whether these domestic responsibilities gave women a sense of agency or simply more things to be blamed for. The daily power you wield is undeniable, but it's also precarious, based on performance, dependent on grace. You pause in the still room that afternoon. It's one of your only private spaces, a small chamber filled with herbs, oils, and glass vessels. Here, you distill rosewater. You dry marigold petals. You fold tiny parcels of camphor for the sick room. It smells of lavender and vinegar, and something faintly sweet. You let yourself breathe. Because while marriage took your name, your dowry, and your legal self, it did not take your hands. You can still make things. You can still transform raw, sharp-smelling pieces of the world into comfort, healing, or even beauty. One of the maids brings you a note. The queen is ill, her pregnancy is delicate. Prayers have been ordered. You nod and return to your rosewater. It's always the women who pray, who prepare, who carry. Mainstream fact to women's labor, both emotional and physical, was the invisible engine of Tudor households. From high-born wives managing estates to lowly washerwomen blistering their hands in lye, the entire social fabric was upheld by women doing work that went largely uncredited. You fall into bed that night aching. Your shoulders burn from lifting crates of winter apples. Your mind spins with numbers. You've spoken to 16 people today, none of whom asked how you feel, and still, tomorrow you will rise. Not because you're obedient, not because you believe in the system, but because the house needs running, and no one else knows that the scullery drain is leaking again. You think of your mother, and your mother's mother, and all the women before you who inherited keys like these. And you wonder how many of them quietly hated the sound they made. It's late afternoon, and you're sitting by the window, quill in hand, parchment before you, trying to compose something resembling affection. The letter must read warmly, but not presumptuously, respectful, but familiar, elegant, but with enough flattery to keep your cousin's family interested in your sister's proposed marriage match. You don't know the intended groom. Your sister doesn't either. But that's hardly the point. Because in Tudor England, love is not something that blooms in hearts. It's something traded in ink. You pause and stare out at the courtyard. Rain begins to fall soft, almost polite. It's the kind of weather that makes you want to read poetry. But instead, you write lines about landholdings, reputations, and favorable temperaments. You try to sound enthusiastic. You try not to sound desperate. Mainstream fact, most marriages among the gentry and nobility were arranged through letters, negotiations, and third-party intermediaries. Courtly love poems and romantic gestures were performed publicly. But real affection, if it came, was incidental, and often unwelcome if it disrupted the plan. You remember the poems your husband once sent you during your betrothal. Flowery, overwritten things about your eyes and your virtue. You suspected even then they were copied from someone else. Later, you found the same verses scribbled in the margins of a book in the library. Attributed to a French knight who died of a head cold, historians still argue whether men believed in the concept of romantic love in this era, or whether it was simply a gamer skill learned like chess or falconry. For women, it was more dangerous. To love unwisely could cost everything. You think of the girl you used to be, the one who read ballads in secret, who imagined a husband riding from a battlefield or reciting a verse by candlelight. You feel vaguely embarrassed for her. She didn't know. She didn't know that most courtships were performed with the same sincerity as a dinner seating chart. That alliances were chosen like horses, bred for endurance, temperament, and pedigree. Quirky tidbit: during one notable courtship, a suitor mailed a noblewoman a live parrot trained to speak a love poem. The bird choked on a cherry pit before completing the second line. The marriage still happened mostly because of the dowry. You watch a servant walk briskly across the muddy courtyard, holding his cloak tight against the wind. You wonder who he loves. You wonder if he gets to choose. After supper, you attend a small gathering in the music room. A young nobleman sings a ballad, something tragic about a knight dying in the arms of his beloved. The women sigh politely. You study the singer's face. His eyes flick to Lady Beatrice each time he reaches the chorus. She's smiling faintly, her gloved hands folded just dash. So is it real? A spark of something genuine? Or is this just more courtly performance? You remember how this system works. A glance too long becomes gossip. A letter, misplaced, becomes scandal. A whisper of feeling becomes a stain on your family's name. Mainstream fact, 2. The structure of courtly love, popularized through poetry and performance, was built on restraint and idealization. A man could admire a married woman publicly, write sonnets to her, wear her colors into battle. But the moment affection crossed into reality, the consequences could be fatal. You excuse yourself early. Back in your chambers, you unfold the letter to your cousin and set it aside. Instead, you take a fresh sheet of paper. This one, you address to no one. You write about the rain, about the music, about how strange it feels to live inside a life built from paper. You don't name names, you don't need to. The words aren't for mailing, they're just for you. Historians debate whether such unsent letters were common among Tudor women. Few survive. But occasionally, pressed between prayer books or stitched into bodices, fragments emerge: verses, reflections, complaints. Quiet voices in a world that seldom let them speak aloud. You blow out the candle, fold the paper, and slide it into the bottom drawer of your writing chest, beneath the accounts and the recipe for salted lamb. It's the smallest act of rebellion. And yet, it feels like something more. Because you can't choose who you love. You can't choose who you marry. But you can choose what you write when no one is watching. And in a world where affection is bought, sold, and borrowed on behalf of others, that, at least, is still yours. You're in the chapel again? Not because it's a holy day, but because it's the only room in the house where no one dares interrupt you. The light filters through stained glass, throwing fractured rubies and sapphires across the stone floor. You kneel, hands folded, but your prayers are not for salvation, they're for understanding. Because last night, your husband returned, and he came to your chamber, not with cruelty, not with affection, with expectation. You laid still. You did not speak. You did not scream. You did not cry. You simply let it happen. Because this is marriage. Because this is what it means to be a wife in Tudor England. Mainstream fact, in the eyes of Tudor law, a husband could not rape his wife, because legally, she had no right to refuse him. By marrying, she was deemed to have given permanent, irrevocable consent. This was not considered abuse. It was considered normal. You sit back on the cold pew now, fingers stiff. You breathe deeply through your nose. You do not cry, not here. Not where saints with stone faces watch from every niche. You remember something your mother told you once. Quietly, as she laced your bodice for a cousin's wedding, you learn to disappear, piece by piece, until only duty remains. And maybe, that's what this is. Not hatred, not horror, just disappearance. Historians still argue whether Tudor women had any concept of bodily autonomy. Some certainly did. Letters and diaries show flashes of resistance. Pleas for understanding, even coded language describing fear of the marital bed. But the system didn't care about subtlety. It cared about heirs. You're not sure how many. Nights like this you can endure, but what choice do you have? The chapel is cold. You draw your cloak tighter. Somewhere behind the altar, a mouse rustles among the dried rushes. And still, you sit. Because if nothing else, this is your hour. Your 1 hour each morning where no one owns your body. Where your mind, frayed though it is free to wander. Quirky tidbit. Some Tudor women reportedly slept with relics or saintly charms sewn into their shifts, hoping divine protection might save them from pregnancy, pain, or worse. Others wrote symbolic prayers in invisible ink, hidden inside their psalters, pleas for freedom disguised as piety. You remember your wedding night. You remember how the midwife waited outside the chamber door to inspect the sheets afterward, to confirm the consummation. Because without that, the marriage could be annulled, the whole house celebrated. You barely remember the meal the next day, you just remember how the wine burned your throat, how everyone looked at you differently, like a gate had closed behind you. You return to your chamber. The bedding has already been changed. The fire is lit. No trace of what happened remains. Inside you sit at your writing desk. The letter from your cousin remains unanswered. You pick up your quill, hesitate, then set it down. Today, you write nothing. You walk the gardens instead. The air is damp. The soil clings to your shoes. The roses are fading, brown-edged and weary. You understand them better than you used to. Mainstream fact 2. Under the doctrine of virtue, not only did a wife lack legal ownership of her property and name, but she also had no separate will. She could not leave possessions to anyone but through her husband's permission. Even her body, in legal terms, was absorbed into his. You sit on the garden bench and stare up at the sky. It is grey, it is endless, and for the first time in a long time, you let yourself feel something like anger. Not loud, not violent, but steady, slow burning, like a coal beneath ash. You think about all the women who came before you, about the girls who believed the stories, about the wives who whispered in kitchens, about the widows who finally breathed. And you wonder what it would take to make the world remember them. Not as brides, not as mothers, but as people. The scandal begins with a whisper barely, a murmur beneath the clatter of goblets and the rustle of silk. By the time dessert is served, it's halfway down the table. By sunrise, it's everywhere. Lady Marian has been caught with a man who is not her husband, in a place where neither of them were supposed to be. You hear the story from your maid, who heard it from the cook, who heard it from the stable boy, who swears he saw Lady Marian's slipper in the reeds by the riverbank. By noon, her husband has left court. By evening, she has been sent away, and you're left wondering if the story is true, or if truth even matters. Mainstream fact. Tudor England dealt with female infidelity far more harshly than male. A woman accused of adultery could be publicly shamed, socially exiled, or in extreme cases, executed specially if she was of noble blood and had failed to produce a male heir. A man, by contrast, might receive a gentle scolding or applause. You sit at the embroidery frame with 2 other ladies. Needle in hand, thread poised over a half-finished carnation. One of them mutters that Lady Marian should have known better. The other snorts. Her only mistake, she says, was being seen. You keep your eyes on the fabric. You do not speak, but the image of Marienbold, flushed, laughing near the river, has taken root somewhere behind your ribs. Historians still argue whether adultery among noblewomen was truly rare, or simply hidden better. With constant chaperoning, little privacy, and the ever-present risk of pregnancy, opportunity was scarce. But letters, poetry, and court records reveal a steady undercurrent of secret love affairs, some passionate, some transactional, many tragic. Later that evening, you attend prayers. The chaplain speaks on Eve's fall from grace, on temptation, on the sacred duty of wives to guard their honor. You keep your head bowed, lips pressed together. Not from reverence, but from restraint. Because you know something, the chaplain doesn't say, there are no sermons for unfaithful husbands, there are no prayers for the women they shame. You walk the garden wall after dark, cloak drawn tight. The moon is fat and pale. Somewhere, an owl calls. And suddenly, you remember what Lady Marian once whispered to you after a feast. Cheeks pink with wine. I'd rather be ruined than invisible. You didn't understand it then, you do now. Quirky tidbit. There were actual Tudor punishments for scolds and disorderly wives, devices like the scold's bridle, an iron muzzle placed over the mouth, and ducking stools, where women were dunked repeatedly into cold water to publicly humiliate them. Men, of course, were never subjected to such treatments. The next day, another rumor surfaces. Marian's father is trying to annul her marriage. The lover has vanished. Some say he's fled to France. Others say he was paid to disappear. Either way, Marion's name is ruined. Her absence is treated like bad weather, mentioned, dismissed, and moved past. At supper, your husband makes a comment about ungrateful wives. You set down your fork, slowly, gently, and you meet his eyes with something he hasn't seen before. Not fear, not deference, stillness. He blinks, looks away. Historians debate how much Tudor women supported or sabotaged each other in the face of scandal. Some letters suggest fierce loyalty between female friends. Others reveal betrayals born of fierce self-preservation disguised as judgment. In a system where your safety depended on reputation, even sympathy could be dangerous. You return to your chamber and pull the curtains tight. You light a single candle, and you do what you've begun to do more often now. You write. You don't name Marion. You don't describe what she did or didn't do. You simply write about what it means to be watched, judged, erased, and then you fold the paper carefully and place it in your locked chest, next to the others. You don't know what will become of Lady Marion. Perhaps she'll disappear into some distant cousin's household. Perhaps she'll be married off to a man with a weak claim and a strong need for silence. Or perhaps, just perhaps, she'll find a way to begin again. But you do know this: the world is quick to forgive a man's pleasure and quick to punish a woman's hunger, even if all she wanted was to be seen. You're summoned to the village square at midday. Not by choice, but by obligation. One of your tenants has been accused of theft, and as lady of the estate, your presence is expected at the hearing. Your husband, of course, is nowhere to be. Found the air smells of damp wool and ash. Villagers gather in clusters, voices low, eyes darting. But what catches your attention isn't the accused boy, barely 15, trembling beside a sack of purloined oats. It's what's happening across the square. A woman, roughly your age, maybe younger, is being dragged toward a wooden contraption you've only seen once before, the ducking stool. Her wrists are bound, her hair is unkempt. She screams, but not in fear and rage. It takes 2 men to subdue her. A third calls her a scold. A fourth laughs. You feel your stomach tighten. Mainstream fact. In Tudor England, a scold was a woman deemed to be overly vocal, argumentative, or disruptive. The term carried no precise legal definition, which made it all the more dangerous. Punishments varied from public shaming to physical torture, most notoriously being strapped to a chair and dunked repeatedly into freezing water. You step forward, quietly asking the bailiff for the woman's name. Her crime, he says, was nagging her husband in public, repeatedly, loudly, and in front of witnesses. You nod, but inside, you're boiling, because you've done that. All wives have. Spoke a bit too sharply, corrected a story, dared to show a flash of anger in the wrong room, at the wrong moment. The difference is simply, you weren't overheard. Historians still argue whether the ducking stool was symbolic or truly punitive. Some records show it being used rarely, more as a threat than a routine sentence. Others suggest it was far more common in rural communities, used to reinforce obedience through ritual. Humiliation. The chair creaks as it's lowered into the pond. The woman gasps, splutters, shivers. She is soaked, blue-lipped, dripping shame. The villagers watch in silence. A few shake their heads. No one intervenes. You clench your hands beneath your cloak. The hearing begins. The boy mumbles his confession. He stole oats to feed his sister. You speak gently, reduce the fine, and send him home with a warning. It's the most you can do. The least you should do, but your mind is still on the woman in the pond, and the line you walk every day between respectability and ruin. Quirky tidbit. Another form of public punishment for women was the scold's bridle. An iron cage worn over the head, complete with a metal bit to hold down the tongue. It was used not only to silence women, but to shame them. Often paraded through towns as both spectacle and deterrent. You return to the manor, cold despite the fire. You bathe in silence. You change into dry clothes, and you find yourself standing in front of the mirror, examining your own mouth. It's a good mouth, sharp when needed, careful when watched, silent when it has to be. You remember your first month of marriage, when you corrected your husband about the number of hearths in the East Wing. A harmless detail, a gentle tone. But he'd gone quiet afterward, lips pressed tight, and later said, "It's better if you let me speak first, next time." You'd never forgotten. Mainstream fact 2. The concept of female obedience wasn't just preached from the pulpit, it was embedded in law, medicine, and household literature. Popular guides, like the Good Wife's book, advised women to speak softly, walk modestly, and defer always to their husband's judgment. Disobedience wasn't just unattractive, was criminal. That night, over supper, your husband mentions the ducking stool. "She brought it on herself," he says. "Women, like that, need taming." You stare at your stew. You do not answer. Because here's what you know now. Your silence is not submission. It's calculation. A kind of armor. And every word you swallow lives somewhere in your chest. Waiting not for revenge. Not even for justice. Just for acknowledgement. Just to be counted. Historians debate whether Tudor women felt solidarity with each other in these moments, or if fear kept them apart. The truth, as always, is likely both. Some whispered comfort, others looked away. Everyone survived how they could. You sit by the fire later, sewing absently, wondering what would have happened if you'd spoken up. If you'd demanded the woman's release. If you'd raised your voice, and you wonder, with a quiet kind of dread, would they build a stool for you, too? The morning begins with a sharp knock and a burst of hushed voices outside your chamber door. The air is cool, the sun just beginning to rise, but already there's movement in the halls. You don't need to ask, what's happened? You can feel it. Another wife has died in childbirth. Lady Alice, 30 years old, mother of 3 living children. Her 4th child arrived last night, a girl, and then bleeding that couldn't be stopped. A priest summoned too late. A midwife, with shaking hands. Linen soaked through and burned after. The child survives. The mother, DOESN, single quote. Mainstream fact. Childbirth was one of the leading causes of death for women in Tudor England. Even noblewomen had access to better food, warmer rooms, and experienced midwives were at the mercy of infection, hemorrhage, and poorly understood anatomy. No amount of wealth could guarantee survival. You sit at the edge of your bed, numb. This is the 3rd woman you've known to die this way in 2 years. There are no processions. No fanfare. Just a hastily arranged burial and another wet nurse hired from the village. Her name is mentioned briefly over supper, followed by silence. Then talk of estate matters. Crop rotations. The king's hunt next month. You excuse yourself. You walk the halls with a shawl drawn tight around your shoulders. Chilled by more than the stone. Historians still argue whether Tudor women approached childbirth with hope or dread. Likely both. Childbirth was a necessary duty, expected, praised, rewarded, but it was also terrifying. Even devout women, those who believed in eternal reward, were known to write out confessions before labor, just in case. You reach the solar, a warm pocket of sunlight where you sometimes read. You find no peace there today. Instead, you sit with your hands folded and think of Lady Alice, her laugh, her quick wit, the way she once told a joke too loud during Lent and made the steward drop his spoon. She is gone now. Her body given over to the earth. Her name already fading behind the name of her husband and the name of her child. Quirky tidbit. Many women in the Tudor period made lying-in preparations before childbirth, stocking their rooms with special foods, religious icons, scented herbs, and lucky charms. Some even commissioned small coffins in secret, hidden away behind linen presses, in case the worst happened. You remember your own first lying-in room, the hushed prayers, the creak of the floorboards, the midwife's warm breath on your forehead. You survived. The child died and single quotes, no one said the word aloud. Miscarriage, loss. The women whispered that the child had been called back. You were told to rest, to pray, to try again. You're not sure which part hurt, more the pain or the expectation to move on. Mainstream. Fact 2. There was little understanding of maternal health in the 16th century. Women were bled to balance humors, fed specific diets based on superstition, and often kept in darkened rooms for weeks. Infection control was non-existent. Survival often came down to chance. That night, a service is held in the chapel for Lady Alice. It is short, brief readings, a few songs. The priest speaks of sacrifice and divine will. You look down at your hands and say nothing, because deep down, you know she didn't die for God, she died for legacy, for duty, for a system that demanded bodies and gave back silence. You walk past the nursery later and hear the baby crying. Her wet nurse hums a lullaby. You wonder what stories she'll be told when she's older. Will she know her mother's name? Her laugh? Her dreams? Or will she only be told, "Your mother gave you life"? As if that were the whole story, you return to your chamber and open your writing box. You begin a new letter. This one, like the others, is for no one. You write Lady Alice's name at the top, and beneath it, you write everything you remember: the color of her shoes, the sound of her sneeze, the way she once danced with her son, in the garden, barefooted and unbothered. You seal it with wax and tuck it into the drawer. Because someone should remember. Someone must remember. And if the world won't carry her story forward, then you will. It's the first morning you've woken up feeling different. Not joyful, not free, just light. Like something has shifted in the air around you. Like the walls of the manor have loosened their grip by a fraction. You lie in bed longer than usual. The fire has gone out, but the silence feels less like loneliness and more like ownership. Because today, you are a widow. It happened last night. A message arrived just before supper. A simple scroll, sealed in wax, delivered by a shivering rider in wet boots. Your husband died in London. Fever. Quickly, they said. Painless, they claimed. A priest was present. You sat still when you read it. You did not scream. You did not faint. You simply folded the message and placed it beside your goblet. The stew had gone cold. Mainstream fact. Widowhood, while tragic in theory, often granted Tudor women more autonomy than marriage ever did. A widow could own property, sign contracts, and act in her own legal name, especially if she had no adult son to act as her guardian. It was the closest many women came to freedom. This morning, the household is quiet, respectful. The staff has entered its strange, well-practiced choreography of mourning. Black ribbons tied to stair rails. Candles lit in unused rooms, servants speaking in whispers. You walk through it all with your hands folded neatly, back straight. But inside, your thoughts race. Historians still argue whether widows in Tudor England were truly independent or simply repositioned into a new kind of subservience to sons, uncles, church officials, or eager suitors. Much depended on wealth, on connections, on cunning, and you, it turns out, are wealthier than you thought. The steward hands you the accounts. For the first time, you sign your name not as wife of, but alone. The ink flows smooth and confident. You are now the dowager lady of this estate. You walk through the great hall and feel it in your bones. You are seen differently today. There's no longer a man to eclipse you. No longer a name that presses yours into the background. You are still not free, exactly. But you are untethered, quirky tidbit, some Tudor widows, particularly those who came into their husbands' lands and titles, were able to control multiple households, fund schools or chapels, and even sponsor books. One particularly bold widow in Norfolk re-landscaped her entire village, including ordering the relocation of her husband's poorly placed tomb, of course. There are expectations. You must wear mourning black for a year and a day. You must not attend feasts. You must avoid music, jewelry, and laughter. You can do that. You've been mourning for years, but under the layers of black silk, you feel something rising. Not joy. Not relief. Power. Not the loud, trumpet-blaring kind. The quiet sort. The kind that sits with its back straight and its voice level. The kind that signs its own letters and refuses to bow. You walk out to the gardens that afternoon. The breeze lifts the edge of your veil. The roses have gone brown, but they are still standing. Mainstream fact 2. Widows were sometimes encouraged strongly to remarry, especially if they were young and wealthy. But they were also feared, in a way. A woman who had survived marriage, who had wealth and no master, was a social wildcard. Too much independence. Too little control. You receive 2 letters by sunset. One is from your husband's cousin, offering condolences and gently suggesting that should you need assistance managing the estate, he would be honored to advise. The second is from your brother. He writes that, while it is too soon to discuss it, a certain widower with a suitable title may be looking for a second wife. You fold both letters carefully, then you set them on fire. You are not property to be passed from man to man like a silver goblet or a fallow field. You are not a second chance at someone else's legacy. You are the author now. That night, you eat alone in your chambers. A quiet meal, a strong glass of wine, and when you are finished, you rise, draw the curtains, and light every candle in the room. You do not cry. You do not pray. You just sit, upright, awake, whole, and you say aloud, softly, I belong to no one. No priest hears it. No servant records it. But the room listens. And, finally, so do you. The bells toll in the distance, low and slow, echoing across fields still glazed with morning frost. From the manor window, you watch villagers gather on the green, heads bowed, faces stiff. They've heard the news. Widows, it turns out, don't need heralds. Rumor is faster. Inside, the house is draped in black. Every curtain pulled, every cushion covered. A token gesture. Mourning, in this world, is a costume worn for the benefit of others. You've mastered the role already. The solemn walk, the half nod of thanks. The properly timed silence. And yet, as you slip your arm through the stiff silk sleeve of your morning gown, you catch your own reflection and freeze. You don't look broken, you look clear, because behind the sorrow, they expect hand perhaps. Even cravers, something else. Calculation. You are a free agent now, even if no one will say it. A player without a leash, and that makes everyone nervous. Especially the royal court. Mainstream fact. Royal widows and noblewomen who survived their husbands often found themselves caught in dangerous political webs. A well-placed remarriage could realign territories, titles, or power structures. This made widows both valuable and threatening, especially if they showed signs of thinking for themselves. Today, the Queen sends for you. Not directly, of course. A letter, sealed, delivered by a servant who bows low and avoids eye contact. You read it 3 times. She wishes to express her sympathy, and would welcome your presence at court when your mourning concludes. A line near the end vague suggests that opportunities may arise for one so capable. You know what that means. They want to see you, assess you, find out whether the late Lord's widow is still tractable, whether she's useful, whether she might be guided. You fold the letter neatly and set it aside. Historians still argue whether invitations like these were meant as genuine opportunities or carefully disguised cages. Some widows rose to prominence, others disappeared, dremeried, absorbed, repurposed into other men's narratives. You walk the grounds that afternoon, thinking, the air is crisp, the trees bare, everything is stripped down to bone. And yet, you feel more alive than you have in years. You pass the old stone bench where your husband once discussed livestock while you nodded politely. You pass the garden path where you used to pace at dusk, rehearsing the correct words for every conversation. You pass the nursery, shuttered now, but still humming with memory. You pause, and then you laugh. Quietly, just once. Just enough, quirky tidbit. Queen Catherine Parr, Henry VIII's 6th wife and a widow herself, remained unmarried for over a year after the king's death before secretly marrying Thomas Seymour. The court was scandalized not because she remarried, but because she chose her husband, a radical act, even for a queen. You return to the manor and order wine, red, spiced. You sit alone by the fire. The Queen's letter still unopened beside you. You consider your options. You could accept the invitation, return to court, smile, curtsy, and carefully maneuver among veiled barbs and velvet ambitions. Or you could stay here, quiet, independent, unbothed, mainstream. Fact 2. Some widows used their newfound freedom to withdraw from quiet households, managing estates, even funding religious or literary projects. These women, though less visible in records, left behind traces in the margins of ledgers and the footnotes of history. After supper, you sit at your writing desk. You retrieve the locked chest of letters, the ones never sent. You reread one, at random. It is addressed to no one. A simple meditation on fear. Written 2 winters ago, after a feverish night when you thought you might not wake up. You remember that night well. The bitterness of mint tea, the ache in your chest, the knowledge that, had you died, the household would have gone on without you. Unmoved but now they wait on your decisions. Your signature, your favor. You write a new letter. This one, you address to the Queen. You thank her. You accept the invitation. And then, at the bottom, you add a single sentence that wasn't in any of your previous letters. I would be honored to serve. Though I no longer serve blindly. You seal it with your personal crest, a rose. Thorns. Still intact, because the game hasn't ended. It's only changed players. And for once, finally you get to move first. The coach rocks and jolts as it makes its way toward London, wheels creaking under the weight of polished wood and guarded silence. You're wrapped in a fur-lined cloak, black still, but finely cut. The mourning veil remains, though you wear it. Now, like a banner rather than a burden, this is not a return to court as a wife. This is your arrival as a widow. And whether they'll admit it or not, that makes you dangerous. Your companion, a distant cousin sent to escort you, speaks occasionally of news from courtho French ambassadors and the Queen's condition, of rumors of a new alliance on the continent, of the King's increasingly frequent rests. You nod when appropriate, but mostly, you listen. Because before you play the game, you learn the board. Mainstream fact. In Tudor politics, court wasn't just a building, it was a battleground. Every conversation was a calculation, every smile a signal. Women navigated it through wit, restraint, and strategic alignment. And widows, in particular, were watched closely. Unattached, unclaimed, potentially unpredictable. As the coach rolls through the city gates, London greets you with its usual chaos, mud and merchant, cries, clanging church bells, and the scent of roast meat mixing with sewage. But as you approach the palace, the air changes, clean, controlled, as if even the air here has been trained to behave. You disembark and are received with bows not bit. Respectful, you're shown to your quarters, finer than you'd expected. Your cousin discreetly disappears, and now you're alone again, except you're not, because, at court, no one is ever truly alone. Servants linger just too long. Chambermaids murmur your name when they think you can't hear. A lady of the Queen's household visits you with no real reason but to note your posture, your tone, your jewelry. You give them what they expect. Calm elegance. Mystery. You're wearing armor now, but it's silk instead of steel. Historians still argue whether noble widows manipulated court politics directly or acted through whisper networks, favor trades, letter circles, shared ladies, secrets. Either way, their influence often exceeded that of wives bound by deference and obedience. That at supper, you're seated 2 places from the Queen, close enough to feel the warmth of the fire, far enough to avoid direct conversation. She glances your way once. You incline your head, respectful, measured. Later, a lord approaches you with a heavy gold chain around his neck and a marriage offer dancing behind his eyes. My late wife was quite devoted to the Psalms, he says by way of flirtation. You smile faintly. Mine favored the Book of Job. He chuckles. He doesn't understand. Quirky tidbit. Some Tudor women developed reputations for veiled verbal barbs-layered comments that sounded pious but cut like knives. One duchess reportedly ended a marriage proposal by saying, "I already have a dog, and he listens better." The man left court within the week. The next morning, you're summoned for a private audience with the Queen. She receives you in her sola, surrounded by tapestries of biblical women, Nesta, Ruth, Judith, with her sword raised mid-swing. The queen gestures for you to sit. You obey, carefully. She speaks of shared loss, of quiet strength, of the burdens placed on women who outlive their roles. You nod, once. We become repositories of memory, you say, but rarely allowed to author the next chapter. Her mouth twitches. That's as close to a smile as royalty gets. She asks what you seek at court. You pause, and then you speak truth. Not a husband, you say, not a title. Just the chance to matter, on my own terms. The queen looks at you for a long moment. Her eyes are sharper than they appear. We shall see what you can do, she replies. Mainstream fact 2. Some royal women queens and widows alike appointed female attendants not merely for company, but for advice. Trusted ladies often shaped policy behind the scenes, relaying messages, curating favor, and influencing courtly behavior. That evening, a letter arrives under your chamber door. It is unsigned, written in an unfamiliar hand. But the message is clear. There are those at court who remember the silence you kept. And now, they're listening. You sit by the hearth, flames flickering low. For the first time in years, you are not running, you are not enduring. You are entering, and they are not ready. The palace hums with tension today. Something unspoken crackles in the air like the weather before a storm, or the moment before a dropped goblet hits stone. You move through it carefully, sensing eyes that linger a little too long. Voices that quiet just as you pass. Another woman has arrived at court. She's young, bright-eyed, and veiled in the flattering haze of recent tragedy. Her husband, a distant cousin to the queen, died in a duel 3 months ago. The rumor is that she watched top. Her name is Lady Cecily, and she's everything the court wants you to be. Soft-spoken, flawlessly dressed, widowed, yes but appropriately mournful, eager to be guided, already whispering with the right men. She's here to begin again, as one courtier phrases it. You smile at her, you speak gently, and you watch her like a hawk, because you know what she doesn't yet. The more charming you are, the easier it is for them to gut you. Mainstream fact: Tudor widows were expected to walk a narrow line, visibly grieving, but not broken. Capable, but not ambitious. Chaste, but not frigid. Any misstep, too much laughter, too much power, too much presence good, tipped public opinion from sympathy to suspicion. You encounter her in the Queen's solar during a needlework session. She compliments your stitching. You compliment her. Lace, a delicate dance. You both know the steps. Later, she sits beside you during Vespers. Her eyes flick to yours, just once, and there's a flicker of something beneath the layers of practiced innocence. Not fear, not pride. Hunger, maybe. Historians still argue whether competition between women at court was encouraged by the system or simply a natural result of limited resources. Few titles, fewer husbands, even fewer chances to shape your own life. Either way, survival often required smiling at the very people who could end you that evening. You're summoned unexpectedly to the Queen's council chamber. A quiet gathering. Just 6 others. All women, you're told plainly. The Queen seeks advisors not in name, but in practice. She is surrounded by men who speak too loudly and listen to little. She wants a circle of women who observe, who advise, who report. She wants eyes, and she's offering you a place. You accept, of course, with the grace of someone who's been waiting her whole life to be asked. Mainstream fact to while women in Tudor England couldn't hold official council positions, many queens relied heavily on informal networks of female confidants, relatives, literate widows whose counsel shaped court strategy, family alliances, even foreign policy. As you leave the meeting, you pass Lady Cecily in the corridor. She curtsies. You return it, just slightly deeper. A message. She may be the court's newest ornament, but you are now one of its instruments. Quirky tidbit. Some court widows developed reputations as fixers. Women discreetly consulted for matchmaking, rumor sifting, and diplomatic maneuvering. One such woman, Lady Elizabeth Darrell, remained unmarried, yet served 3 queens and outlasted 2 coups. Her power lay entirely in secrets. Back in your chamber, you sit at your desk and open a fresh sheet of parchment. You begin writing a list not of names, but of observations. Who favors whom? Which servants carry which letters? Which conversations stop when the queen enters, and which continue carelessly? You don't gossip. You record. You understand the game now. It was never about marriage, not really. It was about access, and you. After everything, after silence, after obedience, after disappearancy, are finally in the room where decisions are made. You blow out the candle, the scent of wax, sharp and warm. Outside, the city sleeps. Inside, the court shifts around you, and for the first time, it moves in your direction. You're seated beside the queen, hands folded neatly in your lap, while a male advisor blusters on about wheat prices and river tariffs, pausing occasionally to make patronizing eye contact, just to be sure you're still with them. You nod once, just enough. But inside, you're counting the number of times he's contradicted himself in a single sentence. 5, no. 6. The queen glances at you sidelong. You don't speak, not yet, but she knows. You're listening, learning, lining up your thoughts like soldiers. When he finally leaves, the queen sighs. He'd be less confident if he had to cook his own dinner. She says, under her breath. You smile. This is the game now, and you're good at it. Mainstream. Fact, despite their lack of formal political authority, Tudor queens and their closest female confidants are fun-wielded, subtle yet meaningful influence over decisions behind closed doors. A well-timed comment, a withheld name, a knowing silence could shift outcomes more effectively than a dozen shouted arguments in the King's Council. Back in your chamber that evening, a book waits on your desk, The Good Wife's Guide, bound in cracked leather, gifted by a well-meaning cousin who still thinks you need instruction. You open it anyway. Page 1. She who obeys is loved. She who rules is feared. You tear that page out. Not out of anger, but because you've finally stopped believing that obedience is your only currency. Historians still argue whether these conduct books genuinely reflected women's lived experiences or merely reinforced the ideals men wanted to see. Most were written by men, of course. Some women annotated them furiously in the margins. Others turned their pages into kindling. You've begun writing your own guide now, not for publication, for memory, for warning. Each entry is short, plain, sharp. A smile means nothing if your voice is gone. The queen watches more than she speaks. Power worn gracefully is twice as dangerous. You hide it beneath the floorboards. You don't need anyone reading it yet. Not while the palace still expects you to be grateful. You're invited to a private supper. Just women. No husbands, no chaperones, no formal agenda. It begins light wine, sugared plums, embroidered fans fluttering. But soon, stories slip free. One woman jokes that she accidentally burned her husband's shirts during an argument. Another confesses she hides money in her shoe soles. You listen, you speak little, but your silence becomes invitation. And then someone asks about that queen's mood. You meet the question with a gentle shrug. She's surrounded by men who think they're brilliant. Laughter, real, unguarded, full. And just like that, you are no longer merely a widow. You are a witness. Quirky tidbit. Many Tudor women passed around unofficial advice manuals in the form of letters, shared cookbooks, and even prayer book annotation spaces where they recorded how to survive marriage, manage servants, fake innocence, and spin truth into something palatable. You write a letter that night, not to a suitor, not to a relative, but to yourself. You begin with a simple truth. I am no longer practicing obedience as a virtue. Mainstream fact, too, for all the outward pageantry of Tudor womanhood, chastity, submission. Many women developed their own forms of resistance, quiet-coded, performed in kitchens and chapels. In the spacing of lace patterns and the tempo of their letters, a parallel language, just beneath the surface. Before bed, you untie your veil, finally setting it aside. Your hair tumbles free, long, unpinned, unpunished. And for a moment, as the candles flicker low, you wonder if this is what freedom tastes like in its smallest drop. What might it feel like to drink it whole? The morning light spills into your chamber like a secret. Soft, patient, almost asking permission to enter. You stretch not delicately, but fully like a cat who's long outgrown the need to appear modest. There's a letter waiting on your table, no seal, no name, just folded parchment, laid with care. You open it, 5 words, written in a fine masculine hand. They are listening to you. No signature, no context, just proof of what you already suspected: you're being watched. And not in the way you were as a wife, measured for obedience, monitored for modesty. This is different. You've crossed a threshold. You are no longer simply someone's widow. You are someone. Mainstream fact. In the Tudor court, reputation was currency, and women's speech was regulated both socially and politically. Too much talk invited suspicion. Too little suggested cunning. But to be heard and still remain untarnished, that was art. You slip the letter into your bodice and make your way to the Queen's chamber. She is seated in the window, holding a rosary, not praying, just thinking. She looks at you, and you both know the conversation won't be about saints today. There's talk of Spain again, she says flatly. Talk of treaties, of marriages. You say nothing. They want me to entertain the notion of betrothing my cousin's daughter, she continues, fingers clinking softly over each bead. She's 12, the man is 50. She doesn't ask what you think. She already knows. Historians still argue whether queens in Tudor England had genuine authority over royal matchmaking, or merely served as ceremonial hostesses to male arrangements. But the letters that survive list with grief, warning, even fury reveal a truth beneath the official language: they cared, deeply, and often, helplessly. That afternoon, you walk the gallery with Lady Margaret. She talks of fashions in France. You talk of nothing at all. But beneath her idle observations is a question. Where do you stand? With the Queen? With the crown? With yourself? You offer only a smile. Quirky tidbit. Some Tudor women developed coded forms of communication through embroidery, through symbolic flowers in bouquets, even through layered metaphors in songs. Entire affairs were conducted through lute lyrics. Entire rebellions, quietly plotted with needles and knots. Back in your room, you take out your hidden book, you add another entry. A quiet voice becomes a blade when sharpened by purpose. Then you sit, you think. You do not write more, because words are not always safe. After dinner, a nobleman seeks you out. Lord Wexham, broad shoulders, polished boots, smile like a fox who's read a book on sheep behavior. He speaks of philosophy, of estate reforms, then, inevitably, of you. Such a capable mind deserves a partner, he says, sipping wine he didn't pay for. Surely you wouldn't want to manage it all alone. You pause, then answer flatly, I've already done more alone than I ever managed together. He blinks, laughs, tries to recover, but the moment's gone. He won't try again. Mainstream. Fact 2. Widows who refused remarriage were often slandered, framed as unnatural or bitter. Yet some built remarkable lives overseeing multiple households, trading, patronizing the arts, even educating girls. Independence was painted as suspicion, but it survived, quietly, in ledgers and legacies. You spend the evening writing again. Not for yourself this time, a letter to the Queen. Short, sharp. Marriage is not diplomacy, is sacrifice, and we have sacrificed enough. You don't wait for a reply. Later that night, you walk the long gallery alone. The portraits stare down: kings, saints, long dead men with hollow eyes. You pause beneath one, a woman, seated upright, fingers clasped over a book, no name, just a lady of the court. You stare at her for a long time, and you whisper, I'll remember your name, even if they didn't, because that's the most dangerous thing you've learned in this life. That silence can be rewritten, and memory belongs to those who insist on keeping it alive. It begins with a rumor, as most dangerous things at court do. A lady-in-waiting claims she saw you slip into the chapel at midnight. Another swears you've been receiving letters from abroad. A third says your books have been marked in the margins, with strange symbols, coded messages, perhaps treasonous thoughts. dangerous independence. All of it is nonsense. Of course, except for the part about the chapel and the books. You light the fire in your chamber yourself tonight. You don't call a maid. You move quietly, deliberately, because you know what's coming. Not an arrest. Not yet. First, there will be a conversation. Mainstream fact. In Tudor England, suspicion was often more damning than evidence, especially for women. Whispers of inappropriate reading, unconventional beliefs, or too many private meetings could destroy a reputation, and with it, everything else. Women were rarely tried for ambition. They were punished for being seen. You're summoned the next morning not to the Queen, but to a bishop. A man with soft hands and a face like curdled milk. He smiles gently as he asks if you've been well, if your conscience is clear, if your soul is at peace. You smile back. As clear as the Thames, Your Grace. He doesn't laugh. He produces a small book worn, annotated in the margins. Your book. Heretical, he says mildly. Some would call these thoughts dangerous. You look him in the eye and say only to those who benefit from silence. Historians still argue whether women truly participated in the intellectual currents of the Reformation and early humanism, or whether they were simply vessels for their husbands' ideas. But letters, treatises, and poems tell another story, one of secret study, subversive dialogue, and resistance disguised as religious reflection. You're released. For now. But now you know. The eyes are everywhere, and not all of them belong to the Queen. Quirky tidbit. Some Tudor women, when accused of heresy or subversion, claimed visions or divine dreams to shield themselves. One noblewoman reportedly escaped punishment after claiming Saint Catherine visited her and told her to burn her husband's sermons. Back in your chamber, you pace. You're not afraid. Not exactly. You've played the game too long for that, but you are, unsettled, because you thought you were past the danger, past the days when your voice might cost you. You were wrong. You receive a letter that evening. This one is unscanned. They think you can still be broken. Prove them wrong. You don't recognize the hand. You burn it anyway, but you memorize every word first. That night, you attend a quiet supper with the Queen and 2 other widows. You eat slowly. You speak carefully. You laugh just enough. But you notice how Lady Cecily no longer meets your eyes. How Lord Wexham watches you like a cat who's tasted blood. And you know your options are narrowing. Mainstream fact 2. Many women under suspicion at court were never publicly accused. They were simply exiled, married off, sent to distant estates, invited to retire. Out of sight, out of conversation, forgotten. You write again that night. Not a diary, not a letter, a plan. Names of those who've helped you, who might help. Again, a map of allegiances drawn in ink, not blood. You don't intend to use it, but if they force your hand, you will, because you've lived as a daughter, a wife, a widow. You've worn silence like a second skin, and now, finally, you are done apologizing for your mind. The knock comes just before dawn, not loud, not urgent, just firm. You rise slowly, the room still dark, the air sharp with cold. You wrap a shawl around your shoulders and open the door to find a maid one. You don't recognize. She hands you a sealed letter, then curtsies and vanishes before you can ask her name. You break the wax. Inside, a single line. Your husband's debts are being examined. You sit down without meaning to, because of course, they're coming for what was his, and what was his, by law, still binds you. Mainstream fact. Under Tudor law, a wife could be held financially liable for her husband's debts even after his death. Creditors could seize household property, income, and even land if there were no surviving male heir to assume the account. A widow, legally independent but still entangled, could be left destitute. You pace the chamber, reading the line again, as if more words might appear. But that's all it says. No details, no names, no kindness, just a quiet threat, dressed in fine handwriting. You sit at your writing desk and open your ledger. Everything accounted for. Every coin, every stitch. But if your husband borrowed in secret, gambling, investing, bribing, you'll be the one paying the price. Historians still argue whether this system was created to keep women in financial dependency, or whether it simply failed to evolve with the growing legal awareness of widows. Either way, the result was the same: power without protection. You visit the steward that afternoon, he fidgets. He avoids your gaze. There are records we were never shown, he admits. Gambling debts, favors owed, a dowry unpaid. You inhale sharply. You had no idea. Your marriage had been a house built on sand, and now the tide is rising. That evening, a man arrives at the manor gate. He is well dressed, carrying a silver-tipped cane, and smiles as if entering a negotiation. He's already won. I represent your late husband's creditors, he says. We'll be conducting a valuation of the estate. You standstill.com, your heart a fist. You will conduct nothing, you reply. Not without the Queen's seal. He smiles wider. Then perhaps we should ask her together. Quirky tidbit. Tudor creditors often attempted to pressure noble widows into remarriage as a solution to financial complications. One famous case involved a widow who was promised full debt forgiveness if she agreed to marry the son of the man collecting it. You return to court that night. A quiet ride. No escort but your driver. You wear black knot for mourning, but for focus. You meet with the Queen before supper. Alone, you tell her the truth, not just about the debts, about the man who came, about the names you suspect are involved, about the pressure closing in, not because you failed, but because you succeeded in surviving. She listens. Carefully. I can intercede, she says. I can delay them, but it will come at a price. You nod. I know. The Queen pauses, her fingers resting on a velvet prayer book. You'll owe me loyalty. I already do, you say. But she shakes her head, not as a servant, as a woman, with power. Mainstream fact, too. Alliances between women and their trusted widows were among the few consistently effective defenses against the crushing systems of law and custom. While such bonds were often invisible to the chroniclers, they kept countless women afloat, protected, and sometimes quietly triumphant. You return to your chamber and begin writing letters, not for pleading, for positioning. You remind your cousin of the land he still owes you. You remind a merchant's wife of the Queen's favor you helped secure. You remind the steward that his salary is signed by your hand. You aren't begging, you're collecting. Because you have learned that in this world, justice is never handed to you. It's leveraged. They can come for your estate. They can come for your name, but if they come for your dignity, they'd better bring an army. You stand at the edge of the receiving chamber, velvet curtains drawn, candlelight softening the lines of every face. It's a small gathering, intimate, but important. A new alliance is being discussed. Two estates, recently widowed on both sides, may be joined again. Convenient, profitable, predictable. You recognize the man at the center of the negotiation. Immediately, he was at your wedding. He is now looking at you. His name is Lord Ashcombe, aged 51, pleasant enough in company, but sharp where it counts. A widower twice over. No surviving sons, and now, quite suddenly, he is in search of a third wife. Guess who the court is whispering about? Mainstream fact. Second and third marriages were common in Tudor England, especially among the nobility. With short lifespans and high mortality particularly. For women, remarriage wasn't just allowed, it was expected. Marriage was a tool for consolidating land and power. Love was optional. You're not surprised, but you are tired, because you can already see the plan forming in their eyes. She's competent, well-liked, no current entanglements, and most importantly, proven. They don't say fertile aloud anymore, but it hangs in the air like dust. Historians still argue whether widows truly had a choice when it came to remarriage. Legally, yes, no one could force you. Socially, financially, politically, it was a different story. Especially if there were lingering debts, or if your continued independence made others nervous. You sit beside the Queen later, just the two of you. She doesn't speak for a long time. Then, quietly, they're asking if I'll bless the match. You look into her eyes, and will you? She studies you. Will you say no? That's the question, isn't it? Quirky tidbit. One Tudor widow famously declined 5 marriage proposals in 2 years. Her reason? I'd rather sit alone in a draft than sleep beside another man who snores. She eventually retired to a small estate, ran a cider press, and lived to 70. That night, you walk the outer gardens. The chill bites your fingers. You let it. Pain, at least, is real. You think about the years you've spent navigating this world, being polite, being precise, being everything except yourself. And now they want you to do it again. To sign your name beneath another man's name, to begin again in someone else's house, under someone else's rule. You're not afraid of marriage, you're afraid of vanishing. Mainstream fact too, in some cases. Widows who remarried lost control of their property and legal standing all over again subsumed. Once more, all gains made in widowhood could be erased with a single ceremony. The next morning, Lord Ashcombe sends you a gift, a book of psalms bound in leather, inscribed with your name and his. You close it. Slowly, then you write your reply. You thank him for the kindness. You note the beauty of the craftsmanship. You wish him every future happiness, and you decline, firmly, clearly, without apology. You seal the letter with your personal crest, and send it with a footman before the ink even dries. That afternoon, the Queen says nothing, but her smile lingers, a beat longer than usual, and later, as you sip wine by the hearth, you realize something startling. You don't feel regret, you feel intact, because you said no, because no one dragged you, because no one silenced you, because for the first time in years, you remained yours. You wake before dawn to the sound of bells, not for mass, not for mourning, but for celebration. A royal wedding. Not yours, mercifully. You dress slowly, slipping into a gown you've worn before, deep blue, modest embroidery, the kind of dress that says, I belong here, but I'm not here to compete. You fix your hair yourself, even though 3 maids offered. You'd rather face the day with your own hands than let someone else arrange your appearance. Because today, you'll watch another girl enter the same trap you were once bound into, and she doesn't know it. Yet, mainstream fact, royal weddings in Tudor England were less about love and more about diplomacy, legacy, and the illusion of continuity. The bride was often young, the groom politically advantageous, and the guest list carefully curated for spectacle, not sincerity. You arrive at the chapel early and take your place among the nobility, close enough to see the bride's trembling hands, far enough not to be mistaken for family. The Queen sits above, jeweled and still, her expression unreadable. The girl is radiant, 16, cloaked in satin, stitched with pearls, eyes wide, like someone walking into a painted dream. The groom is old enough to be her father. Historians still argue whether young noble brides truly believed in the promises whispered to them of affection, of influence, of safety. Some letters suggest they did. Others, that they clung to those illusions simply to endure. You watch as the vows are spoken. You mouth the words under your breath, not as a prayer, but as a record. You remember your own wedding, your stiff smile, your aching feet, the feeling that your life was being signed away in exchange for property rights and painted initials on a hearthstone. You wonder what this girl was promised. Land titles, that she'd be seen. You want to reach out and tell her something, to ruin the moment, but to prepare her for the years ahead. But you know, it won't help. Every Tudor bride has to learn it herself, that a wedding is not a beginning. It's a contract. And she is the collateral. Quirky tidbit, at some Tudor weddings, the consummation was public in everything but name guests would escort the couple to the bedchamber, hand over nightclothes, and even inspect the sheets the next day for evidence, a spectacle of compliance, of ownership. After the ceremony, there's a feast, laughter, toasts, a procession of peacocks and pastries shaped like swans. You sit through it all, quiet and composed, sipping spiced wine and letting your mind drift. You wonder what Lady Marian would have said about all this if she'd been allowed to stay. If she hadn't been exiled for the simple crime of wanting more, you excuse yourself before dessert and walk the quiet halls. The noise of celebration fades behind you. You pause before a tall window that looks out over the courtyard. Below, the bride and groom mount their horses for the ceremonial ride. He lifts her into the saddle like a possession. She waves to the crowd. You can't tell if she's smiling. Mainstream fact, too. Many Tudor brides, especially those married young, were sent to live with their new husbands' family immediately. With little preparation or transition, they left behind not just homes, but identities. Even names were sometimes changed to suit alliances. You return to your chamber. You remove your gown with steady hands. You sit at your desk and open your ledger, then close it again. There's nothing that needs your attention tonight. Instead, you light a single candle and take out a blank sheet of parchment. You write no names, no dates. You just write, I watched another girl walk into the same fire. She smiled. They clapped. No one warned her it would burn. You fold the page and place it with the others. Not because anyone will read it, but because you will. Remember, because someone must. Because in this world of veils and vows, silence is survival, but memory is power. You're summoned before you've even broken your fast. I knock 2 short raps. One pause, one Miranda page delivers the message with practiced neutrality. The Queen requests your counsel. Immediately, you slip into your robe, pin your hair half up, and leave the room without asking why. Because you already know something has shifted. You enter her privy chamber to find her alone, save for a scribe in the corner. Head bowed, ink fresh, she dismisses him with a glance. Then she looks at you and says, the Spanish envoy is here. They want to discuss a treaty. You wait. They've asked for your recommendation, she says evenly, about which noble house might best support the alliance. A pause. They named you? The room stills. By a mainstream fact, widows of noble birth and unimpeachable reputation were often leveraged as tools in international diplomacy. Their marriages or deliberate refusal to remarry could signal loyalty, neutrality, or resistance to foreign crowns. A woman's womb, even long after her husband's death, remained a matter of statecraft. You manage not to laugh, barely. And what do you want me to say? You ask. The Queen leans forward, eyes glinting. I want you to tell me the truth, as you always have. Not as a subject. As a woman who has lived it. So you do. You tell her the truth about marriage, the kind carved out in shadows, not ceremonies. The kind negotiated by men who never wake with bruises. The kind that swallows women whole, then spits out a title and expects gratitude. You speak slowly, clearly, and when you finish, she does not clap, does not cry, she simply nods. Historians still argue whether queens truly sought female perspectives in political matters, or merely entertained them for optics. Some letters suggest strategic intimacy, others, genuine camaraderie. The line between performance and partnership was often invisible, but power flowed through both. Later that day, word spreads that the Queen has declined the match. The Spanish envoy leaves unsatisfied. Your name is not mentioned again, not publicly. Quirky tidbit. Some Tudor women managed to unmarry themselves politically by embracing piety, donning informal, religious garb, living semi-monastic lives without taking vows, or publicly aligning themselves with charitable work. It wasn't sainthood, it was survival with plausible deniability. You begin to notice small shifts. Men stop addressing you with expectation. Young women seek you out in corners of halls, asking gentle questions. The Queen requests your presence more often, but rarely. For business, she wants your mind, not your obedience. And still, the whispers persist, that you were too clever for your own good, that you must have secrets, that no woman survives without bending something like virtue, truth. You let them whisper because you are tired of proving anything. And because the more they whisper, the more they watch, and the more they watch, the less they act. Mainstream fact, too. Records show that women who refused remarriage and remained at court often wielded informal influence longer and more freely than their married peers. though such influence was almost never officially acknowledged. Their names drift through letters like ghosts, unnamed, but unmistakably present. One evening, you walk the gallery and see your reflection in the darkened glass. Not a girl, not quite old, but something else, entirely. You see steel beneath the skin. You whisper, just to yourself, I outlived the trap. And then you smile, because they thought you were the story's quiet ending, but you became the footnote that rewrote the entire chapter. The frost settles in overnight, turning the stone windowsills white and brittle. Your breath fogs the glass as you lean forward to watch the courtyard below. It's empty now, no galloping horses, no fresh brides, no foreign envoys. Just the steady hush of winter claiming everything it touches. You've stopped asking for letters. The people who matter know where to find you. The people who don't, well, they'll keep guessing what you're plotting, which is almost as satisfying. Spend your mornings in the solar now, reading by the fire. The Queen still calls for you, sometimes for counsel, sometimes just for company. You share bread. You speak softly. You no longer tiptoe around court like a threat that needs disguising. You glide. Mainstream fact. Some Tudor widows retired. 2 small private chambers in royal residences, often near the Queen's apartments. These spaces became quiet hubs of influence, intellect, and rumor filled with books, ink, and the sort of women who outlasted marriage and made something of the ruins. Today, you open a trunk you haven't touched in years. Inside, old letters, faded ribbons, and a gown you wore once to a christening. Back when you still hoped your husband might be kind, you hold it to your cheek, then fold it away again, because now, finally, you are not waiting to be saved. Historians still argue whether widows like you were anomalies, or examples whether you were exceptional, or just the rare few who got recorded. But those who lived beneath the records, those who wrote in margins and stitched warnings into sleeves, they remember you. They echo in every choice you've made. You start writing again, not secret notes, not desperate plans, a journal this time for yourself. You write not to survive, but to remain. Quirky tidbit, one Tudor widow is believed to have faked illiteracy for over a decade so that she could read banned books without being asked to recite or explain them. She confessed only on her deathbed with a wink. You sit by the fire as dusk settles, journal open, inkpot ready, and you write, they gave me a name I didn't choose. Then they gave me a silence I never asked for. Now I name myself. And in that name, I make noise. You close the book and breathe in the quiet. Not because you're hiding, but because peace, when earned, is a form of protest. Mainstream fact too. In some of the last wills and testaments of Tudor widows, scholars find small, subversive axe property passed to daughters. Cryptic marginalia in religious books. Secret patronage of female poets. The final word wasn't always loud, but it was almost always theirs. You've left no heirs, but you've left words. You've left choices, logged quietly, scattered like pebbles on a path for someone else to follow. And when you lie down to sleep, tonight alone, warm and unafraid, you realize something. You were never a trap. You were the one who opened the door, and now, here you are. The fire has burned low, and outside your window, the moon rests gently on the frost-covered earth, a silver coin left behind by the sky. You lie back on your pillows, the story still lingering in your thoughts like old parchment dust, soft and persistent. You've walked through corridors of velvet and judgment, sat beside queens, outlived husbands, and outwitted the men who thought they owned your story. And in doing so, you've traced the quiet power of women who were supposed to did in single quotes, T. Let the weight of those years fall away now. Let your breath slow. Feel the cool silk of the past soften into something safe. The faces from long ago, some kind, some cruel, fade now, gently. Their voices dull into murmurs you no longer need to answer. The halls are empty. The candles flicker out. And your bed is not a battlefield, it's a refuge. Still place after storms. You've done more than survive history. You've rewritten your name into its margin. Steady and silent and seen. So close your eyes, let the hush of centuries hold you. Let every door they closed behind you stay shut now, because the one you opened leads somewhere quieter, somewhere yours. Good night, my clever survivor. Sleep well.